Nice Radio Kalaloo presents Just Another Look. Just Another Look is an innovative, exciting, albeit decidedly provocative and yes, certainly controversial, socio-political analysis of issues of a local, regional, and international nature. Just Another Look is heard only on Nice Radio. First aired on Saturdays at 6 p.m. with repeat broadcasts on Sundays at 9 p.m. You can always catch us on the World Wide Web, www.niceradio.info, or you can check out our Just Another Look blog, www.justanotherlook.com. I am, of course, Keith Joseph. Today is Saturday. It is the 14th day of July 2018. Welcome to another edition of your favorite program, Just Another Look. In our previous edition, first aired on Saturday the 7th of July 2018, we began by addressing the fact that we were welcoming Vincentians back home for the carnival celebrations. And we were welcoming visitors. Of course, you may recall that during the promotions by the carnival authorities for this year, there was talk of the international media being present. We had network from Trinidad and Tobago, and of course, CNN apparently felt it incumbent upon them somehow to do some coverage of St. Vincent and the Grenadines. Well, coverage they did. And in the end, one story was about the murder that took place on Carnival Monday. International media have a tendency very quickly to highlight incidents that they see. And sometimes those are not the best incidents in terms of promotion of the country. You may recall the kind of international coverage that was given with the tourists in Bequia. The tourists who were allegedly murdered at Bequia. And remember that led to a major set of media interest in St. Vincent and the Grenadines, particularly the American media. You remember also then Prime Minister James Mitchell being involved in a program on the same CNN. And at that time, it was a program conducted by Greta Van Susteren. And as Prime Minister of the country, one can only hazard a guess that he thought that he could handle it. So off he went. And the next thing you know, at the end of the program, it was clear that he came away thinking that perhaps he was ambushed, because he didn't understand, it would appear, in hindsight. He didn't seem to have understood how the international media works and how these people with the programs operate. So while he was on there, they were able to make connections with this one and that one in different countries and different viewpoints. And he seemed totally unawares. It was an embarrassing moment for St. Vincent and the Grenadines because clearly this was our prime minister that was caught in a situation where responses didn't seem to be able to come as quickly as they ought to have done. And sometimes, we talk big, but we're still small fish in a rather big pond. So, our carnival celebrations are about a reflection, and a very accurate reflection of our society. So when we now have this reporting abroad, who would the government blame for the image of this country that we are giving and which is carried internationally? For a very long time, every time the opposition here made some claims about the state of the economy or other aspects of Vincentian's governance, the response from the ruling regime was almost always they're trying to make the country look bad. They're trying to damage the image of the country in the international arena. It would be interesting to hear what Glenn Beach would say about this particular situation. But it's not the first time we've had a loss of life during our carnival celebrations. But with the presence of the international media, it gets a particular level of coverage that we really don't want. The police service tried its very best to ensure that efforts were made to have a heavy police presence during the carnival. They did well with the traffic. We're not so sure how well they did with with regard to deterring criminal activities. But this is St. Vincent and the Grenadines today, and we've talked time and time again about our inability to address murders. We've pointed to the record number of murders established in this country over the last several years. We have established several new national records in terms of the number of murders committed in any single year in St. Vincent and the Grenadines since the ULP came to office. And we continue to remind Vincentians that if you engage your critical thinking skills, you are bound to ask the question, how is it that we are having so many murders in Vincentian society under a political regime that committed itself to waging a war on crime and the causes of crime? There was a promise to wage war on crime and the causes of crime. And yet it appears that our Ministry of National Security cannot cope with the changes that are taking place in our society. In some instances, their approach may be irrelevant. Their approach may be old school. And there may well be a leadership crisis within our Ministry of National Security. And we have identified that as a major problem for several years. Just Another Look has indicated that as far as we are concerned, it seems as though the leadership of our policing has really been a game of musical chairs. You're never sure what you will get in terms of the quality of leadership in our police service. And we remind Vincentians that this must be one of the only countries in the world to have had its commissioner of police go on leave when the country is in the throes of a general elections, preparing for a general elections and having general elections, and you let the head of your police service go on leave? Amazing. But there is a tendency by our good governance leadership under the ULP administration to be quick to say, and they did nothing wrong. Of course you did nothing wrong. You did nothing wrong. You did something pathetically silly and unconventional. And you could continue to say you did nothing wrong. But it must have helped to make us the laughingstock of the world, or much of the world, by engaging in such an activity. We have not been able to get a grip on crime. And while some are anxious to suggest that we can see a rise in crime because we are developing, we ask, where is that development? We are so far behind. And yet we pat ourselves on the back, we thump our chest, claiming that we have done so wonderfully well. But it seemed ages ago we were talking about being on the cusp of economic takeoff, and we can't seem to find the momentum to take off. Are we getting all sorts of excuses, you know? And the fact of the matter is that they are running out of ideas. In fact, they have run out of ideas for a very long time. We say, or we have said on this program from time to time, that the country has a prime minister that doesn't always seem to operate in a manner that allows us to feel that he's applying his critical thinking skills. One such issue is the issue of integrity legislation. The Elections Manifesto, one of the two that was produced by the ULP for the 2001 general election, because you may recall they also did a youth manifesto. But in the more general manifesto for 2001 general elections, one of the linchpins was integrity legislation. Remember, we had integrity legislation, the war on crime and the causes of crime, and the big thing was, the big capital project was the cross-country road. Yeah, those were the three things. And to be quite honest with you, if we were to take a grade book, the government failed on all three. Those three major things that were being pushed: the war on crime and the causes on crime, with particular reference to white-collar criminality. The cross-country road, nobody speaks about that. They haven't spoken about that for more than a decade. Nobody talks about the cross-country road within the ranks of the Unity Labour Party. It is a forgotten project. They didn't have the decency to come to the Vincentian public and say, well, you know, we made a fundamental error when we were talking about this cross-country road. But there is a sense in which, while we are talking about consultative democracy, while we are talking about involvement of peoples and communities, etc., they don't even bother to tell you when a project has failed. They don't even bother to say, well, you know, we apologize because we did have this as one of the linchpins of our campaign, that once we got into office, we'd be doing this. And unfortunately, friends, it cannot be done. Nope. It was just dropped like a hot potato, like so many other things. You remember the business of the hotel across the Dry River, the ecotourism hotel? You don't hear anything about that anymore. You know, projects are elevated when they are politically opportune. And when they are no longer politically opportune, they are dropped. Yeah? And so they keep looking for these mega projects because they seem to understand that people like to see buildings and capital projects. Those are likely to impress the electorate because the electorate does not seem anxious enough to go beyond the materialistic component. Yeah, they want to see buildings, put buildings, give them buildings. So build an airport, largest capital project in the history of the country. We build the diagnostic center. We build, we fix roads, we build. Yeah? And then we don't discuss the qualitative component. Yeah? So we build roads. We've not too long completed the Leeward Highway. And yet, if the average Vincentian returning home goes up that Leeward Highway, they will see the cut and paste approach that we have taken the thing. Because no sooner were segments of the Leeward Highway, no sooner had segments of the Leeward Highway been completed that we've been forced to patch significant segments along the way. But that's how we do things. We take a little bit from here and we put it over there. We take a little bit from over there and we put it over there. The cut and paste approach to governance. It's a cut and paste approach to just about everything this administration does. And so too, in the realm of crime, it is cut and paste. And we've had several commissioners of police. And when you look at all of them, we continue to have significant increases, new national records in the number of murders committed in this country in a single year. But on the matter of integrity legislation, we reminded you that this was one of the critical components of the 2001 elections manifesto. And they boasted Vincent Beach taking the lead. In the first 100 days, we will introduce integrity legislation. And I'll tell you why that sounded credible. Because under the New Democratic Party government, the opposition had brought something to the House. Even they would admit that it was not substantive. And perhaps they were just testing the waters and testing James Mitchell and his administration to see what the reaction would be. And of course, it didn't go anywhere. But two wrongs don't make a right. And so, coming to the elections of 2001, it was opportune enough for the opposition Unity Labour Party to berate the New Democratic Party over issues of corruption, of greed, of graft, of all sorts of things. And trumpeting on the momentum gained from the street protests of 2000, May 2000, that eventually led to James Mitchell capitulating that elections would be called, at that time seemingly without consultation with the leadership of his own party. Right? And the Grand Anse Beach Accord, agreeing that elections would be held by a certain time. And then, of course, he held on to leadership for a significantly long period of time, and then held on to the prime ministership for a significantly long period of time. A situation that virtually led the party to be ill-equipped for the general elections that took place in 2001. Elections that he had agreed to. So one would have imagined that if you were facilitating elections as a result of the pressures brought to bear by the trade union movement, by the opposition Unity Labour Party, by that coalition that called itself the Odd Thing, the Organization in Defense of Democracy, then clearly you would seek to prepare your party for general elections. That did not appear to be the case. And so they lost. But the Unity Labour Party then came to office trumpeting that integrity legislation was one of the major issues. You see, we have to avoid this situation of public officials not being appropriately accountable to you, the people. And that was the mantra. And there was Vincent Beach hammering it out from one political platform to another. And we promise you, within the first 100 days, that was every time he got on a political platform, that was his role. And we promise you, that within the first 100 days, we will introduce integrity legislation. Well, how many 100-day periods have passed since 2001? After 17 years in office, there is no integrity legislation. There's no integrity legislation. But interestingly, the opposition New Democratic Party did to the ULP what the ULP had done to it when they were in office. You may recall, I said earlier that the opposition Unity Labour Party had brought to the House some documentation calling for the integrity legislation to be introduced. We said it was nothing major, but it was important enough to shake up the government and to say, look, we want integrity legislation. So perhaps it was that Vincent Beach was really talking about when he was saying, we brought something and they didn't want it. Right? Remember he was saying that? So the New Democratic Party, under the ULP government, then brought a piece of legislation to the House for the promotion of integrity legislation. It was felt by some that they too, like the ULP before them, were merely testing the waters. The difference was that in their case, the document was very substantive. Very, very substantive. And the difference was that the Prime Minister was well aware of the documentation. And as you have seen and heard in the tralala between himself and Leacock in the House, there's a question of, hello, what was your position on it then? What was your position on it then? Yeah? What was your position on it then? So, let us look for a moment at the incredulity of Papa, of the country's Prime Minister. Because the Prime Minister, the former leader of the opposition and former Prime Minister Ann Muses raised the question of integrity legislation in Parliament recently. And the Prime Minister of this country, in his response, attempted to suggest that if the NDP was serious about integrity legislation, they would have supported the proposed new constitution in the referendum that was held in 2009. And one wonders if during the parliamentary debate there may have been a lapse of memory on the part of the Prime Minister. Because his response seemed to have lost all sense of academia. His response was pathetic. If we are asking you, you promised in 2001 in your manifesto that you would introduce integrity legislation, and as the government, as the opposition then said, within the first 100 days. But even if you couldn't have done it in the first 100 days, in more than 17 and a half years in office, it has not even reached to the top of your legislative agenda. Not even there. So the opposition, recognizing that you were doing nothing about it, brought a document to Parliament, which the Prime Minister seconded. Which the Prime Minister seconded, and which Sinclair Leacock had to remind him of in the recent parliamentary debate. He seconded the bill then. But he doesn't seem to have remembered it, because he was saying that the opposition had no right to bring it. What do you mean you have no right to bring it? The opposition in Parliament is part of the nation's legislature. Parliament is the legislative arm of government. Remember, we have three components of government, you know. The executive, which in this case is our cabinet. The legislative, which is responsible for making laws, the legislature, which is Parliament. And the judiciary. Admittedly, there are areas of gray between them in our type of system. They're not as clear-cut and enough of checks and balances as occurs in the United States of America. But we have them nonetheless. So the opposition is in fact part of the legislative arm of our government. So there's no such thing as you didn't have a right to bring it. Huh? You didn't have a right to bring it. The Prime Minister said in Parliament that the opposition had no right to bring the integrity legislation bill when it did. But yet, it is on record that he seconded it. And Leacock had to remind him in Parliament, but you seconded it. Yeah? Leacock is quoted as saying, by the Eyewitness News, but we brought the legislation here and you seconded it. Yeah? You seconded it. But Gonzalez's response was, a quote, but the point is, you know you couldn't bring it. End of quote. What do you mean you couldn't bring it? How could you not bring it? And you are part of the legislative arm of government. You are entitled on the people's behalf because you are also representatives of the people. They are parliamentarians. They represent a segment, and a significant segment, of the electorate based on the percentage that they would have gained in total at the election. That's why they're there. And once you are there, you have every right to bring legislation. If there's anything wrong with it, in terms of the way in which it is brought, etc., that's the Speaker that will determine that, not the Prime Minister of the country. The Speaker of the House will rule, not the Prime Minister of the country. So here he was, apparently, this is the Prime Minister's response in Parliament, quoted in Eyewitness News. You know you couldn't bring it, and the reason you couldn't bring it is that it involved expenditure of monies. And Leacock responds, no, because, no, you are mixing up yourself now. That was the Spiritual Redemption Charter. And when Leacock said to him, insisting that you can't win this one, here's where he went. This is the Prime Minister of our country. This is supposed to be a scholar. Listen to where he went. When Leacock said, no, you can't win this one. The response is quoted saying, you may say I can't win it, but you must look at the poll numbers. I just had one. That is why I talking like how I talk here. I got the wind behind my back. End of quote. Understand what we're saying, you know? Here is a prime minister who we were told at some point was supposed to be the brightest man in the country to lead the brightest man to lead the country. But this discussion here reflects, from our vantage point, a seeming dearth of scholarship. A dearth of scholarship. The idea of your not being able to win this one was relating to the argument that they were having. You did, in fact, second the integrity bill brought to the parliament by the opposition New Democratic Party. Is that a fact or is it not? That is all. All Leacock was saying was, look, I am telling you, you seconded it. So if we had no right to bring it, then you should not have seconded it. But why did you second it if we had no right to bring it? Yeah? But in seeking to clarify the issue, Leacock is saying, well, you know you can't win this one, meaning the argument here, because we have evidence that you seconded the bill. And his response is to go into the electoral mode. That is scholarship for you, man. That is scholarship. We keep saying that the ruling regime seems to have an understanding that when the leader talks about people being unschooled and untutored, people being possessive of a sort of learned helplessness, people being malignant and dishonest, they appear to be talking about the Vincentian electorate. Who are they referring to exactly when they talk about people being the lowest common denominator? Who exactly are they referring to? But this line of thinking, this line of reasoning that we have gotten in the last parliamentary session tells us exactly what is the state of play politically as far as the ruling Unity Labour Party is concerned. That even here, clearly the Prime Minister recognizes that he is caught. Clearly, he was brought to his senses by Leacock's insistence that you seconded a bill that we brought. And now you're saying we had no right to bring it. How many years later? All that happened is that the Unity Labour Party's leadership is caught in this trap. You brought a piece of legislation when you were in opposition. Integrity legislation. That didn't fly. In your manifesto, you wanted to so show up the New Democratic Party that Vincent Beach was saying for and on behalf of the ULP on one platform after another. We brought the legislation, but they didn't want it. They didn't want it. But we promise you that within the first 100 days, we will bring integrity legislation. Right? So even if you couldn't make it in the first 100 days, you've had 17 and a half years in which to make that transformation. And you have not done it. You have not brought anything forward. But during those 17 and a half years, the opposition New Democratic Party brought a substantive document to the House. And Leacock is reminding the Prime Minister that at the time that it was brought, you seconded it. In hindsight, you may now ask, why did you second it? Was it because you remembered that in your manifesto of 2001, you had put something about integrity legislation and you wanted to let the electorate believe perhaps that, okay, so yeah, they brought the legislation, we'll discuss it anyhow, and so let me second it and so on. Is that what was done? So he got caught in that bind. Now, some years later, Arnim Eustace brings up the issue and asks about the state of integrity legislation. And your response is that you had your chance. You had your chance. What Gonzalez's response was, and follow the logic, friends. Apply your critical thinking skills. The opposition comes and asks about the state of integrity legislation. Yeah? And Gonzalez is quoted in the newspaper dated Friday, July 6th. Right? That he is, quote, always amused when members of the opposition call for integrity legislation. End of quote. Right? And then he goes back to the referendum which his government lost. And dares to suggest that had they allowed the new constitution to be approved, right, they would have had an opportunity for integrity legislation to be addressed. This is what he's quoted as saying, right? Quote, this is in the newspaper, page 30 of the newspaper dated July 6, 2018. Quote, they had an opportunity for a constitutionally protected integrity commission to address these questions which he has raised and more. So that's the first point that I want to make, because clearly in 2009 the NDP didn't consider this to be such an important matter, because if it did, they would have campaigned for the constitutional reform process. End of quote. You ever hear such ridiculousness? You ever hear such political trite? Even if what he was suggesting about integrity commission kickstarting a process, even if that was supposed to be true, that was a very small component of the proposed new constitution, and has little to do with why the constitution was rejected. But you see, some politicians who feel they're bright have a tendency to link things because they believe that much of the listenership not paying attention. You cannot link the rejection of the proposed constitution at a national referendum in 2009 with one minute part of that document, when the nation, it is not the NDP, the nation rejected the constitution. The youth representatives, as we mentioned in our previous program, first aired on the 7th of July 2018. We mentioned that the youth representatives on the Constitutional Review Commission were not satisfied that the final document represented their views. So they were certainly not in support of it. That's the youth representation. They felt that they were not listened to enough to have their views reflected in the final document. They were very clear on that. So you did not have the majority youth support. But there were other people among the electorate who recognized that the shift to republicanism, any of them may have any particular love for the Queen or the royal family, but what they were not happy with is what you were replacing with it and how you were doing it. There were many aspects of the constitution, the proposed new constitution, that they rejected. And the electorate also remembered that when the interim report of the commission was presented to Parliament, you remember the response of the ULP people? You remember Julian Francis asking them, what are you going with that there? You don't remember that? Do you remember Julian Francis essentially saying, this proposal that you have here, this interim level, of civil society being represented in Parliament. Hello, go to the polls the same way I did. You ain't coming in here through no side door. You remember that? It was sent back. Panel camp let them have to pull their tail between their leg and redo, revisit, etc., etc., because you weren't happy as government at the time with aspects of what you were seeing in the referendum, in the proposed new constitution. But now, 9 years later, it's appropriate. It is opportunistic, politically opportunistic, for you to try the NDP because you really have no answer as to why integrity legislation has not been put in place. So in the Parliament itself, you have Leacock telling you, but when we brought something, you had an opportunity. You had an opportunity. You saw that opportunity and you seconded it. But now you are saying that the NDP had no right to bring it then. But you undermine yourself because you seconded it. So it doesn't seem to be logical. But then you go on to show that as far as you are concerned, they're asking me about integrity legislation now. And I'm always amused when you raise that because, look, I gave you an opportunity by having it being addressed in a manner of speaking in the proposed new constitution. What kind of answer is that, boss? If you were doing an exam, you'll get an F. Or the lowest level. Because this makes absolutely no sense. But this is what the kind of discourse that we have in Parliament, which is why we keep talking about it as a major talk shop and nothing else. That's why we keep referring to the January 2011 speech that lasted over 45 minutes about a plot to assassinate the Prime Minister when not a single individual, based on the evidence that he claimed he was presenting at the time in Parliament, not a single individual was charged on the basis of that for attempt to assassinate the country's Prime Minister. 45 minutes or more of parliamentary time. No wonder the Speaker of the House now saying there's way too much time in Parliament with everybody wanting to talk before we get down to the business at hand. That was a very clear example. But it was in the aftermath of the December 2010 general elections, in which the ruling regime lost 4 seats. That may have been a better link. The speech in January 2011 and the outcome of the 2010 elections may have been more linked than what he was attempting to link here in Parliament with the integrity legislation and the proposed new constitution. You see, the Prime Minister then says, he makes references to Chapter 5 of the Criminal Code, more or less saying, well, there are things that exist in the current constitution that allows for integrity issues to be addressed. That is so. But didn't he know that? Didn't he know that when they put it in the manifesto as one of the linchpins? If you were satisfied then with what existed, you would not have put in your manifesto such a strong emphasis on the need for integrity legislation And you would not have had Vincent Beach going around the country, one platform after another, touting how important this issue was for the electorate, and on the basis of which they should vote you in office. If you were satisfied with what you are now referring to in the nation's criminal code, you would not have attempted, when you were in opposition, to bring a piece of integrity legislation to the parliament. But since you failed with the referendum, you're not looking at it that the electorate rejected the referendum. You're looking at it that the NDP should have seen that if they had passed the referendum, if they had allowed victory at the referendum, we'd have had a constitution in place that would have facilitated a commission, an integrity commission, to kickstart the process. Something doesn't seem right with the logic that is being applied based on what the Prime Minister says. In the same way we had addressed the logic and the content and intent of what Dr. Kiza had said when we were talking about the Milton Cato Memorial Hospital. The same way we addressed the content and intent of Dr. Providence's comments about the mental health center and the views expressed by people about the mental health center and the link she attempted to make when she brought in the concept of suicide, with people losing confidence in the thing and we have suicide being committed. We need always to apply our critical thinking skills, because what the Prime Minister attempted to do in Parliament in response to a very simple question as the state of integrity legislation after 17 and a half years in office is incredible. It's just incredible. Because we expect some measure of scholarship from him, even in these matters. But he gets caught, bushwhacked, because A, his argument is not particularly sound. And then Lika come and bashes him over the head, saying, boss, when we brought the legislation, you seconded it. So what were you thinking then when you seconded it? And because he is bushwhacked, he then changes his tune from when Leacock said, no, you can't win this one, meaning you can't win this argument because we're saying to you, you seconded it. And you're telling us we had no right to bring it, but you seconded. He then moves into, you may say I can't win it. You must look at the poll numbers. I just had one. That is why I talking like how I talk here. I got the win behind my back. Yep. That is parliamentary debate for you. This is our democracy at work. One can only conclude that the Prime Minister may have been in carnival mode and didn't quite understand what he was saying. Because what he was saying really makes little sense. The linkages just don't work. And so his presentation and his responses were really out of whack. Out of whack. If you apply your critical thinking skills and attempt to make sense of what he was actually saying, you'll realize that he was caught out. He just didn't really know how to respond appropriately, and this is what we got. That is the long and short of it.